Well, as we track the B20 process and indeed G20 and what it's all about, we thought we'd speak to some of India's finest voices in the industry space. We've got a wonderful panel with us. Mr. Baba Kalyani, thanks so very much for being with us. Malika Srinivasan, Mr. TV Narendran and Mr. R. Dinesh. So let me come to you first. One of the big agendas of B20 this time around is in ensuring resilient supply chains. Now that's important because when it comes to energy security or food security, the war continues to have an impact. How is B20 looking into this?
So I think there has been a specific task force which actually is headed by Malika, so she can cover the details of it. But overall, if you really look at it, I think the primary focus has been on ensuring that there is a better method of making it inclusive, making it digitally well connected and available across the board. Right. And obviously it needs to take into account the needs of the global south and make sure that cuts across from availability and not just food but also various other requirements across the supply chain.
Sure. And ma'am, would you like to add to that in terms of resilient chains?
Yes, I
whether
think
it's food or energy, so many areas.
Yes, it is the topic that's occupying everyone's mind right now, and it goes beyond it. During the B20 deliberations, I think what came out is that it goes way beyond just alternate sourcing, distributed sourcing and stress testing of value chains. It goes beyond that. It has, of course, as you just mentioned, inextricably linked sustainability issue, but I think it is also exploring how do we build this resilience. And we've been able to take it forward a few steps because of the focus on resilience. A number of new themes, application of technology in trade could enable build resilience, working with LDCs and MSMEs could help build resilience. And I think there is FDI in sustainable ventures could build resilience. So there are a number of initiatives that have specifically been suggested, but I think the important concept is that resilience should not be looked at in isolation as only dual sourcing.
Right.
It needs to be looked at as a set of interconnected themes that include climate change, energy security, distributed sourcing, trade and technology, and inclusivity.
Sure. And we'll talk about those in particular. But the digitalization story, sir, and perhaps you can talk a little bit about that. It's something we take great pride about in India. And you know, we are involved not just at the level of the government, but individual companies as well. It's part of our ethos. It's all about inclusion at one primary level. Do you believe that's a model from India that can go to the rest of the world, or the B20 in this case?
Absolutely. I think one area where India is pretty much a benchmark is on the governance side and the benefits that the common citizen is getting out of digitization. I think Indian companies, manufacturing particularly, have a great opportunity to invest hugely in smart manufacturing because we have the domain knowledge, we have the talent locally, and how do you translate that into value for the manufacturing sector? I think a lot of companies, including many of us sitting here, have already done that. It's a great opportunity because you can drive tremendous amount of efficiencies and stakeholder experiences through a good transformation.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask you, Mr. Kalyani, a broader question about India and our demographic dividend. We are now the most populous nation in the world. We've got a very young population. That means for the next 30 years, if we get things right, we have a real opportunity at going to the next level, moving into the next strata among countries. Do you believe that this is perhaps the greatest asset that we in India have?
Absolutely, there's no doubt about it. If you look at India's economic growth plan from today to 2047, India at 100. And if I just look at the manufacturing sector and just 5 or 6 sectors in that manufacturing sector, the highest growth that India will see will come from automotive.
Yes.
4 million four-wheelers will go from 4 million to something like 30 million.
Yes.
Okay, you're talking about a 7x growth. It'll be higher than that will be the automotive components, because that 7x growth of the automotive sector plus the opportunity for exports using this whole demographics, the younger population, well-trained, digitally savvy. See, what is it that people are looking for when you talk about resilient supply chain? I mean, one part of the resilient supply chain is what Malika talked about or what Narendran talked about. The other part of the supply chain is that people at the other end of the supply chain, the guys who are buying things from you, do not want to spend their time tracking things and wanting to know what is going on and not going on and all that. Now all this India can solve using digital technology, using younger people. This is our biggest advantage. Even the Americans can't do it, believe me. They are just going to go down in terms of their manufacturing capabilities. So are the Germans. I don't know much about the Chinese. Japanese, Japanese anyway are getting old. So who does it leave? I mean, it's India, it's Vietnam, maybe Indonesia.
Right.
And the largest part of the cake for the next 25 years is going to come to India.
Mr. Dinesh, reskilling and upskilling, that's linked to making use of our digital, of our demographic dividend. If we don't get that right, then this is all talk, right?
I think we are getting it right, but it's a process. It's not going to happen overnight, as we all know. So, I mean, we all know about, people getting the industry educational institutions tie up to make people ready to be employed, etc. But having said that, I think in the new digital age, the speed of change is going to be so fast that it's a continuous process. And actually, every private sector, or I would call it every well-run company, is continuously doing this and continuously looking at this. Is there an opportunity to further speed it up? Yes, 100%. Is there an opportunity to further reach out to some of the states or some of the regions where we believe the level of skilling is not available and make them more employable? Yes, equally so. But I think let us also not forget, I think there is, the women population of the world, which we have an opportunity to make more employable. There is also the younger people who are coming into, I would call it jobs, to be ready to be upskill themselves. So I don't think it's a challenge in doing it. Is there an awareness to do it? Yes. Is it happening? Yes, it is happening, but it is more, I would call it, with specific initiatives. And I think the focus will have to be to scale this up and make it into even more important focus. It's not that there is no focus right now.
Ma'am, Mr. Dinesh was talking about the role of women in our economy. I think our demographic dividend is best realized if we've got more women entering the formal workspace. And that has been an area where statistically we've been quite poor. How important is our future going to be dictated from an economic standpoint by greater inclusion of women in our economy, in the formal economy?
Surely, because if you don't use and get 50% of your population engaged to the level that they should be engaged, you're definitely going to be, your performance as a nation is going to be subpar. We really don't match up in terms of women participation in the workforce compared to most economies in the world, and that's been an area of disappointment. So when picking up from where Dinesh left that question, it's really about getting our skilling aligned. You asked the question on skilling. Today, are women coming out of the colleges? The question to ask ourselves is, are they employable? What needs to be built into our curriculum to make that change? There are lots of gaps in terms of skilling. The economy is growing very fast, new sectors are coming up. Beyond digital skilling, we have even skill gaps in the area of healthcare workers, for example, nurses, big short supply. So it's a whole issue is about how can we skill our women appropriately? How can we provide them social support systems that will enable them to take care of children, especially when at the first few years. And that's one of the biggest impediments in the way of their joining the workforce. So what can we do for all as a government initiative? What can corporates do? And really what can educational institutions do? And I think we need to bring all of these together in order to have a holistic approach to women participation.
So, climate change, it's no longer something that's distant, it's upon us. We see it every day. We see it possibly in the floods in Himachal Pradesh, parts of Uttarakhand, etc., etc. How is B20 as a group addressing the challenge of sustainability and climate change?
So I think it's a very important subject, and the good thing is it's a thematic subject. It will continue it has continued from the Indonesian presidency and will continue beyond us. So there are multiple issues to address. Firstly, the fact that this transition is going to be complex and costly. How do you fund that transition? The priorities of the global south are different from the global north. How does the financing flow? How does technology move across borders more seamlessly than it does today? So I think a lot of the recommendations that we talked about is about that.
Sure.
It's also about making sure that the transition is just, is inclusive. We include the MSMEs as well in this transition. So a lot of the recommendations which have come from the task forces are addressing that. The the institute, B20 Institute, which was proposed this morning, is also to help address some of these issues from a continuity point of view. There are sector-specific roadmaps which are being developed. During Indonesia's presidency, something was developed for the power sector. So similarly, we are looking at how can we develop sector-specific roadmaps. So a lot of the focus of this presidency has been on climate change, and I think it will continue to remain the focus for subsequent presidencies as well.
How will B20 economies or our own economy only succeed if there is substantial spend on R&D, innovation and tech? That's also something we're looking at here, in your opinion.
I think that is the ideal world, that you need to spend a lot of money on R&D and innovation and technology. But we don't live in an ideal world, especially in India with such a large population and so many small and medium businesses that almost contribute 60-70% to our economy in terms of GDP. You have to create a democratic platform where these people, or any Indian or anybody from the south, let's say, can get technology, can get innovation, can get ideas without having to spend money on it. I'm not saying you don't need to invest in R&D and innovation, don't get me wrong. But we got to figure out a way to share it. Pretty much like the UPI. UPI was created and today we are sharing UPI with the UAE and with France and maybe tomorrow it will be UK or Germany, God knows where. And in India, hundreds and thousands of businesses have been created using the UPI platform without those businesses having to spend any money to develop and or create R&D.
Right.
So I think the strategy has to be for us, and it's the private sector and the government put together, people who can think about this, to create platforms which will help digitalize the small and medium sector, which will help them use digital and AI technologies in their business without having to spend millions of dollars in trying to develop something.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
That's the way to go. Otherwise, the country as large as ours, we don't have the resources for all this. We may think about billions or trillions of dollars required. We may do the math. I don't know where it's coming from.
And ma'am, a last question to you. The services sector and expansion, not just for India, but also perhaps for other B20 nations. How is that something that is of concern this time around?
So it's a very interesting area because services sector is growing much faster. Services sector is growing faster than overall global trade, and within the services sector, digitally delivered services are growing the fastest. And I think that's raising a whole set of new issues with respect to easy flow of data, interoperability of standards, security, cyber security, and a whole bunch of new issues that I think it would be very, very useful for G20 countries to anticipate some of these problems. Even things as simple as sounds simple, and I say it perhaps more complicated, as a classification of services. We need to address that. So most of the issues are coming from either tariff disputes or interpretations, technical interpretations, etc. So let's begin there. And then there is a whole element of services within manufacturing. And today almost 30 to 40% of manufactured goods, the component is services. So how can we disaggregate those, and how can we deal with more interoperability, standard flow, data flow protocols, etc. So I think there's a whole set of new issues coming because there is an engine of growth for our trade as well as for global trade that we need to capitalize on.
All right. Well, thank you very much, for sharing your thought. There you have it, a quick look at B20 with some of India's finest business minds, looking at the opportunities that the group of 20 nations actually has. This is, of course, the B20 process, but the ideas are common for many countries in the world, whether it is resilient supply chains, whether it is digitalization, whether it is a constant focus on the climate challenge. These ideas are important for billions around the world. We've got a wonderful guest with us, Borger Brender with us, the President of the World Economic Forum. Thanks, sir, very much for being with us. Great to see you in India, not Davos. A little bit warmer over here, I suspect. But let's talk a little bit about what the B20 agenda is. And one of the key issues is resilient global trade. And I think this is important because we've had problems with the Ukraine war. Food price volatility is a huge problem. Energy price volatility is another huge problem. How is B20 addressing that?
So you're right that even if a country like India is seeing historic high growth, there are challenges related to soaring food prices, but also the energy prices. And these are global challenges too that the G20 needs to look at. We have food insecurity now many places in the world. How is it possible to make sure that Ukraine, that is one of the largest producers of wheat, can continue their export? And then on the oil and gas side, we know that the gas prices have been very high. This is due to LNG. Europe now importing a lot of LNG to replace the Russian import. But this means that many developing countries and also emerging economies that were buying LNG before cannot afford it anymore because Europe is paying such a high price. But at the same time, we're seeing that the second largest economy in the world, China, is growing much slower, and they're the biggest importer of oil and gas in the world. So that can also lead to, and the deflation that China is now seeing, can also lead to less demand for this product. So let's see.
Digitalization is an area where India has invested in greatly. And I think, just as an observer, the digital back end has really come together now. There were a lot of skeptics. We were skeptics that what will this actually achieve? Can you link digitalization to growth? But it does appear to be working in several areas. Do you believe it's a model that can be replicated?
I hope so. The fact that 1.4 billion people have their own digital identity, that almost 1.4 billion people are on their cells and at affordable prices. If you have a cell phone, you have an ID number, and you also have a telephone number, you can also then establish your own bank account. You can wire money. This is a prerequisite for growth, inclusion, and poverty eradication. It's such a staggering number for India, because if you look globally, close to 4 billion out of 7 billion are not connected digitally in adequate way, and the prices are too high and not affordable. So look at, for India, this is a huge benefit, a huge driver of growth. So I think the fact that India now has a growth between 6, 7, 8%, it's the fastest growing economy in the world of the big ones, and it has been 3 consecutive years now. And also what is another staggering number is that if you look at what India contributes of global growth, 18% of all global growth now comes from India. This is incredible. So I think one of the driving factors behind this increased productivity is the digital strength of this country, and other countries should learn from India.
Climate change is a concern. We've been speaking about it in Davos now for the last several years. But it's not just for governments to adopt climate change policies. Of course, that's important. It's also for companies. It's also for people across the world. We're talking about B20, but how is the World Economic Forum really focused on climate change as a core agenda for you?
So many of the leading companies in the world are partners of the World Economic Forum. So we have formed different public-private partnerships and alliances. So we have, for example, an alliance that we started in 2014 where we have 120 Fortune 300 companies. These CEOs have committed to make sure that their company is net zero by 2050. And among these companies, there's also hard to abate sectors. We have aluminum companies, we have cement companies, we also have fertilizer companies. So that's one example. Then we have another initiative called the First Movers Coalition, where we have 88 companies, also several Indian companies. And what these companies have promised to do is to use their purchasing powers, because these are huge conglomerates, many of them. And they say, if we buy aluminum or if we buy steel in the future, more of it has to be green. And then they create a demand for green steel, green aluminum, green shipping, green fertilizers, green cement. This is very, very powerful. So these are some like practical initiatives that we have taken, and I think private sector sends a strong message. The paradox, though, is that there is too little happening in the decarbonization still globally, and the misunderstanding here is that people say, oh, it's too expensive. But the reality is that the cost of climate change now is much higher than those initiatives. So the cost of inaction far exceeds the cost of action, but still not happening. It should be common sense, but common sense is not common.
Wonderful speaking to you, sir. As
Thank
always,
you.
it's a great conversation. But it is fascinating what Mr. Brenda actually has to say about India, demographic dividend. But the G20 is also a huge international opportunity for countries well beyond India to look at some of these key areas, upskilling, reskilling. There's healthcare, digitalization as well. It is a mammoth challenge which countries need to really come up around the world and address.